Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your hosts, Michael Maleka
and Molly Hudash. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of our Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your hosts, Mike and Molly. Mike, this one, okay, I know I say most of our episodes are really exciting and momentous, but this one actually is. This is actually the first episode that we're doing in the Psych-Soc realm.
Which is
kind of fun.
It's kind of like a first time. So welcome everyone for a momentous occasion, because this is the first time we've talked strategy. We've talked in like chemistry, biology, but psych-soc is something that we haven't really talked about. But I think at this point, there's a very good reason talking about, especially on the episode that we're talking about today, because I want to make it kind of very clear to the audience. Psych-soc is something I always struggled with. I don't love studying psych-soc all the time, because a lot of the time, you just have to remember things. You have to remember the terms. But I love the angle that we're doing today. I love what we're talking about, because if you are like me and you struggle with remembering things, again, we talk about all the time, don't memorize. I don't, because I can't. This is the episode to do today for you, because today we are talking about memory and encoding. Not only what the MCAT expects you to know, but also how you can use it in your studying. If you are like me and you struggle with memory, this is the episode for you. So I'm very excited to talk about what we're talking about today.
Me too. And in a way, we kind of have talked about this before, because we did do an episode on how to learn content effectively and efficiently. If you've listened to that episode, it's been a couple weeks at least since that episode went live. Maybe we could link that episode in the description for this week.
Sure.
But if you've listened to that, listening today, you're going to recognize some of the terms that we've brought up in the past, the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, right? Spaced repetition, things like that. But also we're going to get into the sort of biomechanics of memory. So how your brain actually gathers information from its surroundings, converts that into a memory, and then how that memory can either be retrieved or forgotten even. And the lens that we're going to do this through, which I love so much, is literally how to study smarter.
Right.
We're going to talk about all the terms that you need to know with memory and encoding for psych-soc, right? We'll get you the vocab you need, but the whole framing is, how can you take action on this? Because I know psych-soc is not your favorite.
Yeah.
There is a lot to learn about it. One of the reasons that I really liked psych-soc, although I also am not someone who can memorize stuff, that was definitely a challenge, but I love it because so many of the things that you learn are directly actionable. Like they actually can help you become more self-aware and be more aware in your interactions with others, and actually can really help you grow as a person and help you grow more, better empathy and intuition about the lives of others. I think it's kind of cool. Yeah. But again, we'll talk about how to learn and memorize and understand through the lens of your life. It's actually something that we'll get into in a few minutes here.
And it's very cool, because also something we'll talk about is the more you can relate to your life, the more you use it in your life, the better you will remember it. And we'll talk about the term that describes that. But let's kind of get started. Like, I think we're down to get started with the foundations of memory in terms of what's the overarching theory that memory actually enters, right? And that's kind of the we've kind of modeled this after kind of computers, right? Where it's the idea that when to form a memory, we need the input. An input comes in, we process that memory, we store it, and then we retrieve it later. That is kind of like the overarching, like the really dumbed down, maybe not overarching, the simple idea of memory on the MCAT. And kind of that first input is kind of where we want to start, right? Where is that first input happening, Molly?
So, and just to put a vocab term to this idea of thinking of the brain as a computer, it's called the information processing model.
Right.
So that's the idea that we're getting at here. It's a very simple idea in many ways, but it helps a lot. Again, frame knowledge in the context of things you already understand. At the time that we were coming up with this, we were getting really into computers. It helps a lot, right? To think of storing something on a flash drive on your computer or whatever, and being able to use that for different things, right? The process that we will actually take in new information and convert it to a neural signal that can then be stored is called encoding. So again, think this was framed with computers. You write it into code, right?
Mm-hmm.
Encoding is that initial process. Then we have storage,
Mm-hmm.
where that information is stored on a computer
Mm-hmm.
or in the neural connections in your brain, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or the synaptic connections in your brain, really.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have retrieval, right? So if you need that information, you're going to pull it back out of your memory, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of this three-step system in the
Mm-hmm.
information processing model. But even within that, there are
Mm-hmm.
different layers to memory that we talk about, right? It's not just like snap your fingers and something that you experienced is in your long-term memory forever, right?
Mm-hmm.
The thing that you have to keep in mind is, as human beings, and especially Mike knows that I love evolutionary biology,
Oh, don't even start.
especially thinking about all of
Mm-hmm.
human evolution, the
Mm-hmm.
majority of it was before the digital age, right?
Mm-hmm.
This point in history that we're out in right now is very unprecedented in terms of even just the history of life on Earth, where we have cultural evolution really taking place much faster than biological evolution. Most of our biological evolution has occurred way before we had
Mm-hmm.
books and computers and chat GPT and all this other crazy stuff. And so we need to understand memory through that lens.
Mm-hmm.
If you consider now, but also, hunter-gatherer societies and before, you are constantly taking in new information all over the place. Your sound, you're getting sound and hearing, right? But you're also
Mm-hmm.
seeing what's going on. You're feeling things, you're
Mm-hmm.
tasting things, right? Your sensory information is critical and you need to form memories. If I
Mm-hmm.
eat this and it makes me sick and I
Mm-hmm.
throw up, I don't ever want to eat that again, right? Or when I hear this sound, it means prey is close by and that's a
Mm-hmm.
good thing. Or a slightly different sound is a predator close by and
Mm-hmm.
I need to remember the difference because one will get me food and one will get me, eaten.
Mm-hmm.
So like the actual roots of memory are very critical. And I think when we talk about things like sensory memory and then coming into short-term and working memory and then what makes it to long-term memory and the different types of long-term memory, it's helpful to think in that
Mm-hmm.
framework, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
that really is what encoding is. There's different layers to it.
Mm-hmm.
And how far along that process in that continuum we get determines how long we will keep that information with us.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start out. We have an actual stimulus,
Mm-hmm.
right? We hear a bird call or we hear a sound in the woods or we see
Mm-hmm.
something.
Mm-hmm.
It comes in. First thing that we see is sensory memory. Mike,
Mm-hmm.
what do we understand from sensory
Right.
memory?
And so I think this is always the first part for things to, because this, I love that how you phrase it. Like, okay, we started talking about these things when computers were coming about, but I mean, these things developed years and years and years ago, well before computers. Well, the information to come into the brain, really, we have to first sense it, right? Information doesn't just get downloaded in the brain. It has to
Right.
be like first sensed. Anything we don't sense doesn't get in the brain. And
Mhm.
so we have to first pick up that signal, really. And
Mhm.
picking up that signal is kind of the first place, which is our sensory memory. And when it comes to sensory memory, it takes in so much. Like imagine all the different senses that are happening right now, right? I am touching things, I'm seeing things. I see you, Molly. I see my
Mhm.
desk, I see my wall, lights. I'm feeling my shirt, I'm
You're
feeling my
tasting your chocolate
ring.
milk.
I'm tasting my chocolate milk. I'm tasting maybe the lunch I had earlier today. Like there's all these senses that are happening right now, but so interesting because like we don't actually like comprehend or process all of that. But so it
Mhm.
takes in a lot. It takes in a lot, but a lot of it ends here. Like a lot
Yeah.
of it doesn't go on. A lot of it ends here. So we take in a lot, and a lot of the information is very short. Like it doesn't live in sensory memory for a long time. Depending on how it entered sensory memory, it will depend
Mhm.
on how long it lasts but generally it's very, very short. So we have kind of two kind of storage areas in the sensory memory. There's kind of iconic memory and echoic memory. And
Mhm.
so iconic memory, I'm thinking like icons, like I see icons. So iconic memory is all the things that you see. All the things you
Mhm.
see live in short-term memory, or no, sorry, no, sensory memory for
Mhm.
about a second. If
Mhm.
it stays there for a second, and if it doesn't move on, it's lost, right?
Mhm.
And then we have echoic memory, which is, I'm thinking about echoes. and that's a sound, right? Sounds stay in short-term memory, sensory, I keep on saying sensory memory for about 3 to 4 seconds. So it's a little bit longer. And and the way I remember that, sounds live a little bit longer in your sensory memory is I can't remember how many times, like somebody's like told me something, and then I'm like,
Are
oh
you
wait,
listening to me?
are you listening to me? And then at first I'd think like, oh, and then I actually like remember like, oh yeah, you just said this, even though I didn't recognize it at first. As soon as I asked, I'm like, oh, I did remember what you just said because I was able, it still lingered long enough in my sensory memory for me to pull it into the next stage. And so that's how I remember like echoic things you hear do last a little bit longer. Again, it's still like 3 to 4 seconds, a little bit
Echoing
longer.
in your
Yeah, it's
in
still
your brain for
echoing
a little
there
while.
for a little bit more than iconic memory, which is like a second, then it's gone. And I think this is also really cool. And I don't know if this is actually correct, but I think this is what magicians also use to kind of like for like visual techniques, is you see a lot of the things when it comes to magic, but you don't like register it because it's so quick and it's gone right away. So are you seeing
That's
what? Mhm.
that's a really good thing to bring up because of the importance of attention
Mhm.
when we're going to bring a stimulus from sensory memory into the next level, which
Mhm.
is short-term memory and then working memory.
Mhm.
Um, the difference in
Mhm.
something that you actually like can consciously engage with or that you really notice versus
Mhm.
something that just is perceived by the eye or by the brain from signals in your eye, let's say, if we're talking about visual, is attention.
Mhm.
So magicians in your situation, they use sleight of hand. They get your attention over here while they're, grabbing
Something.
something from you over
Right.
here, right? Like
Right.
they're distracting you. They're taking
Mhm.
advantage of your like misdirected attention to do something covert. Um,
And it's not like your eyes didn't sense it. It still probably it was
mhm.
in your visual field, but because you weren't attending to it, it
Yeah.
entered iconic memory or that sensory memory and then just dissipated because you never actually paid attention to it. And I think this is a really good like segue, right? It's things enter the sensory memory, and then if you don't pay attention to it after 3 to 4 seconds for echoic, like things you hear, it's gone. After 1 second for iconic, it's gone. But if you pay attention to it, right, that's
Mhm.
what brings us to the kind of the next kind of level, right? Because things aren't really useful if it's in sensory memory. But now we kind of go into the next stage, which is our working memory or our short-term memory.
Yes.
And this is where, like, when you're actively thinking about things, this is how I always think about short-term memory. Like, whatever's on my mind is my working memory. It's like what I'm working with. Right. And when we talk about kind of working memory slash short-term memory, that's kind of there's kind of like two parts to this. One of these are active and one of these are more passive.
Yeah.
So when we talk about passive, that's more like the short-term memory. Like that stuff, it's like I'm not really attending to it, but it stays there for a little bit. So when we talk about short-term memory, this is when we talk about I think it's what Miller's rule? About the number of things we hold in short-term
I
memory.
know it's 7+2 or
Yeah, I think
7 plus or minus 2 rule.
yeah, that's the number. That's how much information we can keep in our short-term memory. I always kind of remember this number because phone numbers are, and that's always the way is like phone numbers, other than the first 3 digits for the area code, is 7 digits. And so it's 7 plus minus 2 is the things. And again, there's factors like age impacts this and, background like genetics impacts this, but that's around an average that we can actually hold in short-term memory. And we can hold that there a little bit longer than sensory memory if we don't do anything to it, which we'll talk
Yeah.
about. If we don't do anything to it, we can hold that 7 plus minus 2 pieces of information for like 30 seconds.
Yeah.
Then it's gone.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of students get really confused over the difference between short-term and working memory
Mhm.
because ultimately they're describing something similar and yet they are distinct. Okay.
Mhm.
Short-term memory versus working memory, the big difference, like you said, is how actively you're engaged with it. So,
Mhm.
short-term memory, you have paid attention to it, but you're not thinking very deeply about it, right? Your eye might be focused on something, but that doesn't mean that you're processing it. It doesn't mean that you're trying to manipulate that information in your head. You're not really doing much with it, right?
Mhm.
If I just tell you to, look at something, right?
Mhm.
You might passively notice something about it, but
Mhm.
you're not going to remember it for very long,
Mhm.
right? Unless you're told to keep something in mind. Like if I just put a phone number on the screen, you're seeing it,
Mhm.
right? You
And I
might
paid
have
attention.
some
Mhm.
level of memory for it, right? You're
Mhm.
still paying attention to it, but if I tell you I'm going to give you a test on this later. Make sure you know this.
Mm.
What you're going to be doing is, oh, shoot. Okay, I need to keep this in mind. How can I break this information up so it's easy for me to keep in mind? And then how can I make sure I don't forget, right? You're probably going to be very active. One of the things that we do a lot in that case is repeat it over and over and over. This is a component of working memory because I have to keep I am responsible for this information. I need to make sure that I remember it. It's different than short-term memory that's very passive, right? In working memory, it is active processing, right? And we actually talk about different layers of working memory. And the one that we're engaging with the repetition in your head, right? If you're trying to remember a phone number, it's called the phonological loop. Like you are basically saying it in your head again and again and again and again and again and again and again, just trying to make sure that you don't forget what that number sounds like so that you can repeat it later. And if I'm trying to remember something and then Mike was really mean and just started shouting out random numbers.
Classic.
That's going to be a lot harder.
Right. It's going to be a lot. And I think you hit on an important note where the the phonological loop is a lot of usually like verbal information because you said you didn't just like read it and you read it over and over. No, you said it to yourself.
You said it to yourself.
Over and heads. And because that's kind of the real piece where it's like it's verbal information that we're saying to ourselves over and over in our head to keep it in mind. And because this idea of like what is the methodology, what is the like, I guess the medium in which it entered into our working memory is also what distinguishes it from one of our other aspects of working memory. Another way that we keep information active in our brain to help us to eventually encode it, right? Which is our visuospatial sketchpad, right? And again, I love the names a lot. I love PsychSoc sometimes because like the names a lot of the times
are fun.
they're fun and they also tell you a lot about what they do a lot of the times. Or the names are like, oh yeah, which is why I love sometimes where you don't have to memorize it, just think about the name.
Think about what it says.
If I'm thinking about visuospatial sketchpad, what kind of information is useful for, I'm thinking about visual information and spatial information, like my area, my surroundings sort of deal. And so that's going to be another way where we keep it in our visuospatial sketchpad for processing.
And a sketchpad. You're imagining like I'm drawing a picture of it. It's very visual. It's not a loop like hearing a phone ring on a loop again and again.
And so those are ways that we're in the working memory, different types of information is kept in the working memory using these either the phonological loop or the visuospatial sketchpad. But then now we have to ask ourselves, what if information has a lot of these different types? Like what if it has both verbal information and visual information? Okay, so what do we do in that case?
Well, we need to combine them. We need to integrate them somehow, right? And that is going to be the role of the episodic buffer, right? So it's basically taking these two different types of information and fusing them to tell a story about them that makes it more memorable.
Right? And which again, the whole idea is making it memorable, or it's putting these things together in the episodic buffer that's going to be really important for its eventual encoding, right? And with all of these different aspects, though, there has to be something that organizes these things, right? That organizes, okay, this information I need to combine, because right now I'm getting a lot of different inputs that I'm paying attention to. I need some way to coordinate, my visuospatial sketchpad and my phonological loop. How am I going to put them together? What pieces of information am I going to put to make it into an episode in my episodic buffer? That's the role of a central executive, right? If you've heard that term, the central executive I kind of think of it as like a coordinator. It's coordinating these different aspects of working memory to make a cohesive episode. Right? Because again, when we think about it like really objectively, like again, I love the evolution of biology, like you were just getting so much, like if we think about it really objective, there's so much just random information happening. Like if you did not classify information properly, it's just like, okay, I see there's like different signals firing at this different point where the central executive really kind of puts it together to make it really cohesive.
Yeah. And I think one thing that we want to really hit on with working memory, short-term memory to a much, much lesser extent. Right. Both of them, we are paying attention to a stimulus. That's what prompts encoding. Okay. So that's what they have in common. But working memory, again, the way that they were introduced, we thought of short-term memory first. We talk about short-term memory a lot, but working memory really is where we add a lot of depth and manipulation to that information. And the big question is, will this die off here, or will it be converted into a long-term memory? How important was this information to you? How deep did you process it? Which we'll talk about processing in a minute too. Is this going to be converted to long-term memory, right? And when we think about how this connects to MCAT, right, I think it's really valuable. I think there's a point that we can reflect on sensory and short-term / working memory with studying. If you are, let's say you're listening to this podcast, but you are also doing 6 other things, and more so than actually listening and paying attention to it, it's just playing in the background. None of you, if that is what you're doing, you're probably not going to realize it's what you're doing because you're not going to be actually listening to what you're saying, but that would be sensory memory.
Yeah.
Okay. If this was playing in the background while you were like taking a shower or walking your dog or doing all these other things, and you're not even paying any attention to it, all this information is gone in your sensory memory right away. Okay,
it's lasting that echoic 3 to 4 seconds, and then it's gone.
I always think of when people say, "Oh, I'll just re-listen to recordings of my classes while I'm asleep because that'll work." No, it dies in your sensory memory. You're not paying attention. Short-term memory, right? If you paid attention to it, cool. You get a little bit longer to hold on to it, but unless you do something with it, it's probably not going to go anywhere, right? Unless you have either, maybe it was a sound that you've heard and you paid attention. You're like, oh, that was weird, and then you kind of just went about your day, and then 10 seconds later, a lion jumps out of the bush. Okay, that was still passively being stored because I paid attention to it. That's short-term memory. I'm not actively wondering what was that, replaying it in my head. That's working, but it can still be converted if I have a significant event, right? Working memory is something that is involving a lot deeper processing, and that is much more likely to be converted to long-term memory. So this is your cue, right? When you are studying, don't let this be passive. Right. This is really, working memory is active learning, right? You are making sure that you are manipulating the information, you're repeating it to yourself, you're making it make sense, because every extra ounce of attention and, effort you put in, that's going to be directly related to how strong that memory is when it is converted to long-term memory.
Right.
So this is why we talk about active learning.
Right. And then the better that you encode it, like when you encode it, that's related to how well can you retrieve it when you need to. I think another great MCAT application of working memory and short-term memory is also when you're reading passages, like when studying, absolutely. When you're reading passages is also an important thing, because I do this exercise all the time with students, where I sit down with them and ask them, okay, read this first paragraph as if I wasn't even here. Always do this. And then they read the first paragraph for me. And then they get to the end. They're like, okay, Mike, I'm done. And then I ask, what did you just read? Without looking back at the paragraph, what did you just read?
Take the paragraph off the screen.
Yeah. What did you read?
I love that.
And barely anyone can answer me. They're like, oh, I have no idea. But then they complain all the time, like, oh, I'm missing details in the passage. Like, no wonder. Because a lot of the times when we read passages, I'm sure I'm talking to somebody right now, they just read and read and read. They paid attention to it for the second that they were reading, and then they just kept on reading. But like we said, short-term memory, if you're not actively doing anything with it, 7 plus minus 2 pieces of information, and I can promise you these paragraphs have more than 7 words. I can promise you. And it's so interesting, because notice what usually students remember is the last sentence of the paragraph. Oh, you mean the last 7 words that you read? Interesting. And so when we are reading our passages, we actually use a method we call chunking, right? And then we'll talk about chunking later on, but where you read about 7 to 10 words, again, there's a reason for that, and then you paraphrase, you visualize what you read before moving on. In this way, that you are going to be working with it a little bit, encode it, and then move on, because now you've actually done something with it. Whereas if you don't, and you just keep on reading and reading and reading, yeah, you're paying attention while you're reading, but then no wonder you're going to forget it after those 7 words have been passed. And so this is another active way that you can use these ideas in not only your studying, but also when you're actually reading passages, because we know this, but let's use that information to our benefit.
Yeah, it's so, as you were saying that, reading passages and kind of digesting as you go,
Mhm,
it is exactly best practice in cars.
mhm,
Um, and if anyone here has used the Chrome extension, log
mhm,
on to our cars material. I just refilmed all of our cars diagnostic tool, cars QPAC
mhm,
1 and cars QPAC 2. And
mhm,
that is the exact strategy that you're going to see in all of those videos is,
mhm,
okay, we read this sentence. Was there anything critical enough that I need to take it with me into the next sentence? Yes.
mhm,
Now condense it into
mhm,
just a few words because
mhm,
that is much easier to store in your working memory when you get into the next sentence. Then you
mhm,
get that one. Does this have anything critical that I need to carry with me? Maybe not.
mhm,
Okay. It's not like I'm going to forget it. It's not like I
mhm,
hate that sentence. It's not, it was useful or useless, but I'm going to move on. I've got my one little chunk of words here. Read the
mhm,
next sentence. And basically, you're collecting little nuggets of the author's argument. You
mhm,
get them on paper in a very condensed format, and then
mhm,
you move on. And you
mhm,
now have, you're able to take things out of your working memory because
mhm,
you used it throughout the paragraph, and then you
mhm,
get them on paper in your map. And now you can come into the next paragraph with a clear head. So it's
mhm,
like, it's very, our
mhm,
car strategies are very cognitively based, right?
mhm.
Like
Right. It's not
it's
random.
very
There's a lot of
connected to what we
intention
do.
behind it. Yeah. Mhm.
Our word intention.
Yes.
Yes, but let's talk about what everyone loves, right? We've
Mhm,
talked about working memory. That's the
mhm,
part that's a little more exhausting.
mhm.
It sure would be nice if sensory memory could just be directly hooked up to long-term memory
Would be
and just,
amazing. I mean, a
yeah,
little bit overwhelming, to be honest. If
way
I'm
too overwhelming for me.
like, I'm like, yeah, I'm
Um,
like getting all the sense all at once. I'm like, oh my gosh.
yeah,
But okay, but let's
sure.
talk about like the place where we all want all of our memories to go, right?
Yeah.
Which is long-term memory, right?
Yes.
Getting if we've worked with this information enough, we've kind of assembled it into a clear episode in our episodic buffer. We've kind of coordinated enough and translate that, encode it in our long-term memory. Long-term memory is kind of I always think of it as like the data bank, like you said, like the disk drive, right? Where and
Mhm.
this is really important when we talk about some aspects of long-term memory. Like the idea that it lasts there forever. Like information, when it gets to long-term memory, the idea it has unlimited capacity and it's potentially permanent, right?
Potentially.
Potentially, where
Asterisk on it.
there's an
We'll talk
asterisk,
about it.
yeah, with the potential. But there is the idea of unlimited capacity, even better than any computer we have out there. There's
Mhm.
unlimited capacity in long-term memory. A lot of people think like, oh, I'm putting too much information. Like, will things
Yeah.
leak out? Like, no, it's still there. I mean, the issues usually are retrieving that information is usually the issue. But long-term memory, it's unlimited and potentially lasts there forever.
It's unlimited and will last there forever if you use it and
Mm-hmm.
recall it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You got to use it or you'll lose it, right?
Right.
And that's why I wanted to clarify potentially
Mm-hmm.
the fact that it's not guaranteed to be there forever. Think about think about what you studied in the first week that you started working in the MCAT.
Right. Right.
Like you don't probably remember any of that because one, you're brand new to it. And so you probably were not using the best study methods, let's be honest, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know I didn't,
Mm-hmm.
right? And also it's been a really long time.
Mm-hmm.
And if you did not review those notes, if you didn't review that
Mm-hmm.
material, it's probably gone now. Okay.
Right.
So our brains have nearly infinite capacity here.
Mm-hmm.
And those memories can be permanent.
Mm-hmm.
But how long it will survive depends on how often you use that information. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Theoretically, we've got unlimited storage, but we will be talking about forgetting and memory decay. And
Mm-hmm.
the key theme there for when we do talk about it a little bit later in the episode is, did you use it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You have a random piece of information, some fact and figure that you memorized in history class when you were in 8th grade. Do you
Mm-hmm.
remember it now? Probably not, because you
Mm-hmm.
never needed that again.
Right. Right.
I'm sure some of you guys think that that's going to
Mm-hmm.
be the case for physics and OChem.
Mm-hmm.
Guess what? No, it won't.
Yeah.
You won't use those
We always think
things
it's gonna.
in med school, I
Mhm.
promise you.
Right.
Right. You will, if you do commit it to
Mm-hmm.
memory and you use it, you're going to remember it forever. And that's the cool thing. But
Mm-hmm.
even from there, we could talk about a lot of different types of long-term memories because learning, the unit of force, right? Being a Newton, like
Mm-hmm.
that is highly specific knowledge that you
Mm-hmm.
have. You could put it to words, you remember learning it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That would be what we call an explicit or
Mm-hmm.
a declarative memory.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are also implicit and non-declarative memories. These are things that you learn without really meaning to learn, right? But let's first talk about explicit. Again, explicit because I explicitly remember learning it, right? Or I could declare it to you, right? Like it's either, if we talk about semantics, it's all based on knowledge and facts. This is mostly what you're going to learn for the MCAT, right? It's a lot of knowledge, a lot of content, although we'll talk about other types of memories in there too.
Sure.
And then there's also episodic memories. These are things that happen to you. So personal experiences, episodes of your life. I could recount, walking my dog this morning. I can recount, bringing one of my dogs home from the shelter. Like I have these memories. I didn't learn it in a book. I learned it because it happened to me. And again, I could explain that to you. I could bore you all.
You just
with the
declared
feeling
it.
of
You
I declared
legitimately
it just
just
now,
declared it right now. Those experiences in the same way you declare content. No wonder then it's part of explicit or declarative memory.
Yes.
Right.
And that's very different from implicit memory, right? That you can't really explain, or it's very difficult to explain, like riding a bike. Like,
Right.
imagine writing a procedure for that. Like, okay, first pick the bike up, and then you have to like pick up the kickstand and then step over it and then ride the bike. Like,
Yeah, like you don't go through that
one,
process when you go through
and
it, right?
you don't think about it, you just do
Right.
it.
You just do it. So like
Yeah.
habits and like habits are in part of our implicit memory. Like these sort of things that we don't think about and do. These procedures are part of, like, again, it's like procedural memory. Are all part of implicit memory. But I feel like a lot of the times there's some things that are part of implicit memory that we don't usually like students actually don't usually associate with implicit memory when it actually is. Things like priming. Like when we're primed for something, like when I say I'm cueing you a lot, where I'm like, okay, red, 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 think of a fruit. Interesting.
Apple.
Apple, wow.
I
Okay.
wanted to say like,
Banana.
a grape. Well, I guess there's red grapes too.
That had
Yeah,
like banana.
banana,
But like you
blueberry.
notice how I bet, even if you wanted to say that, when I said red, red, red in this fruit, I bet you, even though that's what you wanted to say, apple still came into your mind first.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah, and then I would have, you're like, apple, I know
I
I'm
was
like
gonna consciously throw a wrench in your
right.
plan, but I decided not to.
Yeah, but that would have been a conscious thing, not an implicit thing.
Exactly.
But that's the idea where priming is part of our implicit memory, where it's not conscious. Priming isn't a conscious thing, but it just happens and can influence us, as well as conditioning. I think that those are kind of like in parent, like not exactly the same thing, obviously, but like those have the same sort of pathways where you've been conditioned implicitly to do something, and therefore that's why you do it. When we talk about conditioning, I mean, we're not going to really go into the depth of conditioning today about like operant and classical conditioning, but where those things live, we say, is in our long-term implicit memory.
Yeah, and keep in mind, conditioning is all about associative learning. So you've learned that two things are associated, right? Classical conditioning, you learn that one stimulus is associated with another one, and you kind of borrow the response to one because the stimuluses or the stimuli are tied, right? And another in operant conditioning, it's my actions are tied with a consequence. And you don't learn that in a textbook, right? And sometimes you can learn that without even being consciously aware that you've now associated those things. Think phobias, right? Or the dog drooling. That's not a conscious.
Pavlov, shout out to Pavlov.
Yeah, it's an implicit, unintentional association that you make. And
But
so we use. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, well, we can use that. We could actually use that to our advantage when it comes to studying too. I think we were actually talking about this before, and how when we're studying or even taking exams, right, we can kind of put ourselves in the condition, like testing conditions, so that we can prepare ourselves and associate the conditions of the exam with how we're supposed to perform, right? A lot of the times we see a lot of, I mean, I see this all the time with students who say, oh, when I took my practice exams, it was like 10 o'clock, I had a drink with me, I had some snacks, like I was able to pause during exam, like it was kind of noisy, right? These are sorts of like a situation that's not going to be representative of test day. But if you associate the testing conditions with, oh, being quiet and not having a snack and having those situations, you kind of pair it with the idea of being focused, right? With the idea of, oh, this is a familiar feeling. So when you have those feelings on test day, when you have experience all those things, you're like, oh, these are feelings associated with a calm test taking experience. A lot of times people don't associate those things, and that's why test day is something totally different when in reality it's just the exact same.
Yeah, and that I think gets really involved with context dependent memory and state
Mm-hmm.
dependent memory, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like people always say like, if someone out there drinks alcohol, right? Let's say that they have a little too much, they're feeling a little intoxicated and they have an event happen, right? It might be hard for them to remember the next day or when they're no longer intoxicated, but it's actually easier to get them to remember if they are intoxicated again, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the situation that was present during encoding
Mm-hmm.
is important, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually part of the trigger to remember that. It's not that you
Mm-hmm.
can't, of course, involving intoxication, we've got other
Sure. I mean,
layers
there's
that we add on, but
aspects, sure.
they even have done studies on people that were scuba diving.
Oh.
Like we give you like a little memory game at the bottom of the ocean, like while you're scuba diving, and then you come back up and you take a quiz on what you learned. And then they give you a different quiz when you're back underwater scuba diving, and you remember it better when you were scuba diving again,
Oh,
because that was the
interesting.
same environment.
Mm-hmm.
You have the same stimuli of the mask and the pressure and the sensation of being underwater and the visual cues. Those are all the same. So
Right.
yeah, state dependent memory and context dependent memory are very involved with studying. So make sure you're studying and especially taking practice tests in a way that is going to mimic your performance on test day, because it will be easier for you to remember the things that you studied and learned if you learned it in a similar context. So if we have not made it clear in other episodes,
Right.
put your phone away when you're
Yeah,
studying.
absolutely.
Do not do it. I know it's tempting. Put TikTok away, put Instagram away. If you really love studying with friends or things like that, and it helps you a lot, cool, but maybe try and get some alone time in there too, because you're not going to have friends with you on test day. Keep snacking to breaks, right? It's not helpful to be munching on popcorn the whole time that you're studying or like sipping on your coffee. If you can get yourself used to the focus for an hour and 35 minutes, take a 10-minute break, grab a snack, use the bathroom, do whatever you need to do, focus for another hour and a half, take a lunch break, 30 minutes, do whatever you want. Like the more that you can do to help your practice mimic your studying, the more you can take advantage of the innate memory and encoding, realities of your brain.
Right,
Right.
right. And I think that's the cool thing about what we have the opportunity to learn in Psych Soc, right?
I
These
love
are
that you said opportunity. I
I
love that.
know, like
It's
it's
an
not
opportunity to
we
learn it.
get to learn these things because we
I
can
love that.
use them for success on the exam that we're studying them for, which I think is super super cool. And so I think this is kind of like really hit on like the next thing we want to chat about, because we've gone through the different parts of our memory. We've talked about the sensory memory. We've talked about short-term / working memory, where going from sensory to short-term working is attention. By working with the information that's in our short-term memory, we're kind of working with it, and then by working with it, we're encoding it to long-term memory. And we've talked about the different compartments things live in and the different types of memory. But let's focus on that like encoding piece. Like,
Yeah.
what are some ways that we can maximize that encoding from working memory to long-term memory? There's actually some strategies that the MCAT actually wants us to know when it comes to encoding, which I think is so cool that this is content. Like what we're about to talk about is content, but things that are like, hey, it's like kind of like the MCAT saying, hey guys, use this stuff like to help
Do
you out.
this, yeah.
Use this.
Here's some tips.
So let's talk about, I think, and we've kind of mentioned a lot of them kind of even passively already, but let's actually like hit them kind of like
Let's test your
like
short-term memory,
it's like
folks.
kind of test the short term or maybe long term if you're really, work using these strategies already. And I think the first like high yield kind of encoding strategy to know is the idea of chunking. Chunking information is a really, really critical tool when it comes to converting things to long-term memory, right? I remember like learning these things, like learning about this when I took like psychology, like in undergrad, where I would redo these exercises where it's like, okay, if we just get a list of things, if you just see a list and you just try to rote memorize the list, it's near impossible to like memorize everything in that list. But say if we group that, like let's say it was a list of animals. Like say it was a list of animals and there's like animals all over. But let's like say we groups the animals like, oh, all the ones that start with B and all the ones that start with C and all the ones that start with like D. It's much easier to remember that list if you've chunked them in some way you've broken it down and classified them. You're like, oh, I remember this chunk and this chunk and this chunk. In this way, you've just taken all this information, and because you've assigned meaning to different categories, it's so much easier to remember. And we can do this with so much of our MCAT content. I mean, some of it we learn it already in the chunk. So I'm thinking like the personality disorders, like we already like chunk it in that way. So that's, I mean, really helpful for me. But we do this with so many other areas. And again, sometimes we don't learn it, like if it's not laid out in a textbook pre-chunked, but we can chunk that information on our own to help us remember it. And I think that's the kind of first way that you like, if you implement this, I think for a lot of, especially some of those kind of harder things to memorize, I think it's such a valuable tool.
Oh yeah. I've got so many things that I like to say about chunking. The first thing is relevant to what you brought up before, which is phone numbers. There is a reason why instead of giving you 10 numbers to remember, right? 3 for the zip code, and then it's, it's 10. Instead of giving you 10 numbers to remember, they give you 3 chunks of numbers to remember. They give you the area code that's in the bracket or in the parentheses, and they give you 3 numbers dash 4 numbers. That is 3 chunks of information instead of 10 individual numbers. You are much more likely to remember it because rather than 10 individual things, you now have 3 chunks of things. It's much easier to remember. And as we talk more and more about other encoding strategies, I really think about amino acids. And I actually want to give you one example that will illustrate 3 of these things. Okay. So we're going to talk about chunking, mnemonics, right? Which a lot of us are familiar with already, right? And then also this idea of putting something in context to your life. Okay. So there are 3 mnemonics that I use for my amino acids. Keep in mind, there are 20 biologically relevant, right? I'm not going to list them all for you because there's too many.
Right.
And it's hard actually to just think of them all in like alphabetical order. I could give you all the 1-letter abbreviations and I could tell you all of them, but it's going to be in my preset chunks because that's the easiest way to remember than 20 in a row or 20 in a, some random list. So for our uncharged amino acids, right, to help me remember which is 1 chunk, right, of the 20. Grandma always visits London in May for Winston's party. It's as weird as it gets, but it's weird enough that it sticks in my head. I'm imagining my grandma. I don't know who Winston is, and I don't know. We're not, English, but okay, she's going to London, right? Like I can put this into context in my life and say, okay, cool, right? That is a mnemonic device, right? Because ultimately I could be thinking, okay, GAVILMFWP, like I could remember all the 1-letter abbreviations of those nonpolar amino acids. And it's also useful because I now can remember a huge chunk of those 20 with a very, small, relatively small amount of information that I need to actually keep in my head, right? Santa's team crafts new quilts yearly. That's one for the polar amino acids. But my favorite for this is actually the one I used for the charged amino acids. And this one has layers to it.
Interesting.
Right?
I'm
because
ready.
You have acidic, which would be negatively charged, and you have basic, which is positively charged. Right? If I want one mnemonic to also include 2 different groups, I have to add an extra level to that. Right? So the mnemonic I use is dragons eat knights riding horses. So DEKRH, right? Those are the
interesting.
those are the charged amino acids. Again, I've chunked them from the original 20. I've chunked them into this list of 5, which by the way, histidine can be charged. It's a little asterisk.
It's a weird one. Yeah.
But 5 that can be charged, that's already a chunk. I've used a mnemonic device to help me remember dragons eat knights riding horses, but I need to add another layer of being able to remember which ones are acidic versus basic. I've got 3 nibblings, which is nieces and nephews, by the way. Fun word.
No way. I was like, what are you saying right now?
It's real.
Like,
I have 1 niece and 2 nephews, and I hate saying that, so I'm just going to say nibblings. And when they were young, I would always read them stories. And I've read, especially my little niece, some little princess and knight, medieval stories. That's a memory that I have of them, right? And there's a dragon in there. And my nibblings are terrified of the dragon chapters, right? So I think when I read those, right? Dragons eat knights riding horses. I'm going to tie that to a memory that I have. And I'm going to think the chapters where the dragons in there and the dragons eating stuff, they were terrified. They had a
Very
very
negative.
negative
Yeah.
emotional response to that scene. Then when the knight comes in on the horse, right? The knights riding horses, that chapter, they're like, yay, right? It's the most immediate positive reaction, positive emotional reaction. Those are the positive amino acids. Dragons eat, that's the negative emotional reactions, right? That is so many layers
Of memory
of
devices that
memory,
you're
but
using.
it's so easy. I will never forget it for the rest of my life. It's like the easiest thing for me to possibly remember because I've added so many layers,
Right, of those
right?
encoding strategies, right?
Yeah.
100%. And
And
it's
I've
so
attached it to something I would remember anyways.
it's so amazing because yeah, you brought in chunking, like chunking the amino acids. You brought in mnemonics, using those mnemonics. But that's self-referencing effect. That's the kind of the thing that you're using, right? Which is you are using a personal experience and relating it to
To
this thing
anchor
to
that
anchor
semantic
that.
memory. Yeah.
And that's why I'm thinking like whenever and a lot of times like in the classes that I love when students come in with their own mnemonics for things because they're
Mhm.
like when they've come up with them they have a story behind it, they have some reason that they brought that up. And I always answer this, I'm like, honestly, that mnemonic, I have a completely different one, but that's the one I want you to use because that one
Exactly.
is for you, right? And that's why like any and a lot of times people use pre-made mnemonics, and again, don't get me wrong, I use a lot of pre-made
Yeah.
mnemonics. I'll go right,
They're
but if
helpful
but
if
if
you
you
can
have
attach it to your life.
if you can attach it to your life. But even if you come up with your own, I would argue that's even better because you now have some a personal attachment. You have some self-referencing piece where you can always go back to that. And so if you use these layers, oh my goodness, the memory just comes up right away. You've cued it already, and it's so much easier to kind of bring back. So yeah, we've talked about kind of three huge ones already. We've talked about chunking, mnemonics, self-referencing effect, if you can relate it to your life. We've also, the next one to kind of talk about is something we have actually went like in depth on in another episode,
Mhm.
right? When it comes to spacing effect. When it comes to encoding, it's very important, and this kind of brings back the use of Anki and spaced repetition. Because when we encode information, you said this before, where information, right, if we don't use it, we lose it, right? And
Mhm.
so to ensure that's encoded, it's important that we regularly don't just expose ourselves, but kind of bring it back, like kind of recall the information rather than just expose ourselves to the information, right?
Mhm.
Because by kind of recalling that information over different periods of time, it's much more of a solid memory. It's not as fluid because if I learn it once and then I try to remember it like 2 months from that point, it's gone. But if I am reviewing it at first, like, okay, every day, then every other day, then every other week, and then every other month, this way, it was so solid that I don't, again, the amount of times I need to review it, spaces and spaces and spaces, because it's become such more of a solid memory because I've utilized the spacing effect where I've reviewed it over time. And this is related to the idea of the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, where by reviewing things regularly, when we learn something, we begin forgetting it right away. Like we begin to forget it. But by reviewing it, by spacing out the times that we're reviewing, we're resetting the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, re-bringing it back to 100%, and then the rate of decay, and we'll dive more into decay, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, the rate of decay slows down a lot more. So this is why the spacing effect is so important, reviewing things regularly, and that's how we can encode things and keep it encoded for a much more long period of time.
Yeah. So
Mhm.
you're kind of hitting at the spacing effect for sure, which is about how far away you separate your testing sessions, right?
Mhm.
In that case, we're talking about Anki or spaced repetition. These could be flashcards, but also it could be practice passages and questions, right?
Right.
Get practice with the way that you or with the medium that you'll be using to take the test. So
Mhm.
in this case, passages and multiple choice questions, right? You can space those out as well.
Mhm.
And one thing that I think is really fun to hit on
Mhm.
is why, and I feel like I'm going to get ahead of myself a little bit too, but
Mhm.
why is it so nice to actively recall things? Why is that so good? Why
Mhm.
is it important to test yourself? Why is it important to use this information again after the original process of encoding it into long-term memory? And it's because we have, yeah, unlimited capacity, sure,
Mhm.
but only for stuff that we use. How does the
Mhm.
brain tell how much we've used it, right?
Mhm.
Because keep in mind, these memories are not as simple as a flash drive on your computer or a, a folder that you've organized stuff. It's not that literal, right? You've got a gigantic web of neurons in your brain, right? And a memory is associated with a very particular activation pattern, right? And they're very interwoven, right? Even saying a spider web is way too organized, right? Like it's incredibly complex. But the thing is, those neural pathways are connected by synapses, okay? And the more that you activate those synapses, the stronger those synaptic connections actually become. And it's really cool. I'm going to hint into neuro a little bit.
Well, that's a good, yeah, just go for it.
We did a whole episode on the nervous system earlier, which is bio and psych soc, but we'll link it for you if you guys want to go check it out, to talk about synapses and action potentials and all those fun things. But the really cool thing, if you imagine what you know about an action potential, right? We'll do some recall there. Think about what you know, right? We have an action potential coming down one neuron, and it's going to cause the release of neurotransmitters from that presynaptic neuron. It's going to enter the synapse. It's going to bind to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, change its voltage, and change its membrane potential. And then possibly, maybe it'll fire an action potential, maybe it won't. Okay. If you have repeated stimulation events in that exact synapse, so with that presynaptic neuron and that postsynaptic neuron, if that keeps firing because you've learned it and then you learn it again and you recall it and you bring it back and you review it again, that synapse is going to become much stronger. And it actually biochemically does this by the presynaptic neuron is going to have a lot more neurotransmitter ready to go, right? It's going to be a wave of neurotransmitter instead of, to give you a hypothetical, 10 neurotransmitters, there's 100, right? It's much easier for that neurotransmitter or that presynaptic neuron to activate the post, right? On the postsynaptic neuron, you could also have more receptors for it, right? Again, it's the more that you stimulate between two neurons, the easier it will become to stimulate again. So you learn it once, but if you never look at it again, you are losing out on that process. And we call it long-term potentiation. There's a flip side to this. If you don't use a neuronal connection for a long time, there is long-term depression of I've made this connection and I never use it. This is not something that I really care that much about. Not only am I not going to upregulate that connection, I'm actually going to start breaking it down.
Like you actually
Your
start
brain
losing.
is very actively remodeling itself. Neuroplasticity.
I remember like seeing, you can actually, if you look up videos of this, you could see videos of this, like of this long-term potentiation, long-term deterioration done in the lab under a microscope. And it's very cool to actually see the neurons, like actually moving towards the axons and forming these axons moving, these terminal boutons moving and forming these much stronger connections with certain cell bodies, and actually like some branches of the terminal boutons actually deteriorating and actually disappearing, which I think is such a cool idea. But again, I love when we can connect like these kind of psych-soc processes with an actual biological impact, because that, again, helps us to remember, especially if we're more of a bio fan like myself, that like this idea of spacing actually has a biomechanical background. There's a reason behind this, which I think is really, really cool. And you also brought up something that's really important when it comes to spacing, right? The idea of testing as well. And I think this is something that a lot of people neglect, a lot of students neglect early on in their studying, where when they're first learning information, they just learn it. They try to memorize that out of a textbook and they're like, okay, I've read this chapter of the textbook. I'm good. Let's move on to the next one. But this is the idea up to the testing effect, where in order to help encode memory, no, you have to actively quiz yourself. You actually have to actively test yourself on the stuff that you learned, because it's not only in that, oh, you haven't really learned it yet when you expose yourself to it. It's when you actively quiz yourself that it helps to encode the information. Again, quizzing isn't just practice. Practice in itself is the learning. Right. And this is where the testing effect comes in, to actively quiz yourself. And then we can combine it with spacing, where we're quizzing ourselves over periods of time to help retain that information, which I think is critical. Like we don't just want to reread information. Like when we review, like I don't want you to always, like anyone listening, I don't want you to simply just read things when you review. I want you to actively quiz yourself in the review. That's where one of the big aspects of when you're regularly doing exams, when you're like, and this is kind of for me, I mean, we talked about this in the Anki episode, but
I know.
I
I'm itching to
yeah,
talk about
I'm
Anki.
like,
I
we talked
hold
about this in the
myself back.
Anki episode where like Molly, you love Anki. Anki is such a fantastic tool for so many people. I was not a huge Anki person. I was not somebody that Anki worked for me, and that's okay. Everyone's different. But for me, I had to leverage another tool, and that was the testing effect. I quizzed myself regularly, and that was my form of spaced repetition. So that was again, and so that's where if you're not a fan of Anki, maybe test yourself more.
If you're not a fan of Anki, go listen to our Anki episode because I'm a big fan of Anki and I'm a huge proponent for it, but I also use it in a very different way that most people use it.
True.
I think the way that most students use Anki is a pretty big and kind of miserable waste of time. So I've got a lot of feelings about it, and if I start talking about it, I will make this episode twice or like an hour longer than it should be. So I will not, but go listen to Anki episode. Yeah, and then make sure, because we talk about how deep the processing should be, and the deeper the processing goes, the better you will remember it. Make sure that you are prompting yourself to truly respond with your understanding, not just with a fact or a figure or whatever, right? When you're doing your own testing, whether it's flashcards or whatever it may be for you. And definitely get a mix of topics, because ultimately the MCAT is going to test you on a bunch of different things in the same passage. So, and we talked about a lot of good stuff. I feel like for recall and forgetting, we talked about pretty much all of this already. Just to kind of round us out here, recall is actually that last process, right? We have it in storage and we need to grab that information back out of our long-term memory in order to use it for something. Okay, there's different types of recall, and there's also a different layer of processing called recognition, right? And I feel like it's important to hit on those differences, especially when we talk about understanding versus memorization, right? You can recognize something. That's as shallow as it gets, very low effort. It's like literally, yeah, I think I've seen that before.
Yeah.
That's it. That's like, yes, I've seen that term before. Do I know what it means? No, but I can.
And does that reset the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve at all if you just recognize things?
No, because it's not recall.
Yeah, exactly.
So recall is actually going through the process of pulling something out of your long-term memory. That's the big difference, right? So you are going to your long-term memory, picture it like a storage room, right? And you're looking for that piece of information, and then you find it and you recite it, or you use it for something. Okay, that is the thing that will actually cause long-term potentiation, actually reset the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, etc. We could talk about free recall, where I'm just like, Mike, tell me everything that you know about physics for the MCAT. Like,
I'm already okay, like where do I even start? And I think that's where a lot of students like feel, even when they're taking like exams and when doing practice questions, they feel like, oh, I have to just free recall. Like, oh my goodness, they're asking me about this. Oh my goodness, like I have no idea where to even begin. But this is actually something you and I talked about before, Molly, where on this exam, there's not actually really any free recall when you're doing this exam. Like I can't actually think of a single scenario where you have to just free recall information while you're doing passages. A lot of the times it's simply just cued recall, where the distinction between them is free recall is you have nothing to go off of, you're just kind of like recalling it freely. But cued recall means there's some sort of a cue, there's some sort of a hint, there's something you're going off of to start that recall. And we actually talked about this a little bit last episode when we talked about science passage strategy and how to actually read a science passage and then buzzwords, where the passage serves such a huge role in cueing our recall for the questions, right? Again, we're using our psych soc terms, where when you're going through these questions, you should already be primed. You should already be cued in order to recall the information, in order to know, oh, how was I supposed to think this way during this question? It was the passage that should have cued you, that should have cued your recall in order to be ready with that information. And so when it comes to this exam, there's usually very little free, actually, if I can't even think of a single place where you need free
You'll
recall for
never
this,
get it.
right?
It's a multiple choice test,
Exactly. Like
right?
you'll always have the information in front of you, so there's something to cue you always. Not to say that free recall isn't useful in studying. Like in studying, a free recall is, it's I think I mean I think just generally it's harder to recall things freely, but if you can free recall, cued recall just becomes so much easier, so much more like straightforward, I would say.
Yeah, and recognition is also valuable on test day, especially if you don't really truly know what's going on and you can't recall from your
Mhm.
long-term memory.
Mhm.
Just going based on recognition, what have you seen before? What feels right, right? It's
Mhm.
very, it feels much more implicit, right?
Right,
It might
right.
have actually been part of your semantic memory, but now it's under so many layers that it's hard for you to actually recite what you know. You could still use recognition, but just be careful with it because
Mhm.
if you just go based on recognition, you're going to fall for a lot of trap
A
answers
lot of
trying to
traps.
be
Yeah.
parse. Okay.
Mhm.
Because they'll put a term that you like or a
Mhm.
term from the passage, but the context around it, the meaning of it is different.
Right,
Okay.
right.
So just be aware of that, right? This
Mhm.
is recognition can help, right? But
Mhm.
it's a very shallow level of retrieval, right?
Mhm.
Recall is truly much deeper. And that's why we talk about Anki and practice questions and all that fun stuff.
Mhm.
Really, we've talked about so many actionable things here. The only
Mhm.
thing we haven't officially mentioned is decay, right? But
Mhm.
again, we have just
We
not in the
kind of
right
I
way.
kind of referenced it a little bit. Yeah.
It's all about the fact that we do have unlimited storage, sure, but our brain doesn't want to be responsible for unlimited information
Mhm.
because not all that information is useful, right? So
Mhm.
if you don't use something, it's going to go away. That
Mhm.
Ebbinghaus forgiving curve, Google it. Maybe we could put a picture of it on the screen
Right. Possibly
somehow.
editors.
Basically, the idea is within a
Mhm.
day,
Mhm.
like a day after learning something, at least half of that memory is gone. At
Mhm.
least half of what you
Mhm.
have learned is gone.
Mhm.
By a week out, you're at 10% or less of what you've
Mhm.
learned if you
Mhm.
don't review it,
Mhm.
right? But through spaced repetition or that spacing effect we talked about, it resets. You go back up to 100% of that initial memory, and then the rate of decay is going to get smaller, right?
Mhm.
Very, very important. Absolutely amazing. There's so many other things that we could talk about with
Oh my
memory, but
goodness. Right.
I
Yeah.
feel like our goal in setting out to talk about this material was to talk about how you can study smarter, not
Mhm.
harder, right?
Mhm.
How you can get more out of the hours that you put in so you can
Mhm.
still get sleep and get some exercise, see your friends
Mhm.
and family,
Absolutely.
take care of yourself. So these are all specific tips and tricks. Again, just to give you some action items, right, of
Mhm.
the things that we talked about. Look into spaced repetition. If you
Right.
use Anki and it's working really well for you and scores going up and you feel great about it, keep using it how you do. If you don't, and
Mhm.
or you're using it, but you think maybe you could do it differently,
Mhm.
listen to our Anki episode.
Check
I
out
have
our
a
Anki
lot of
episode.
strong
Yeah.
feelings,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Make sure to process as in depth as you can. Don't just be satisfied to say, I'll figure
Just
it out later.
surface level. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Dive in deep. Why
Mhm.
is why is it the way that it is?
Yeah.
Especially for the things that are harder for you to learn,
Mhm.
right? So dive in deep. Try and engage with multiple layers of processing at once, right? We call that the dual coding
Right.
effect, right?
Mhm.
If you can have visual information and echoic information and you're connecting it to other things going on in your life, right?
Mhm.
The more that you engage different levels of processing, the better you're going to get. Test yourself, make it relevant to your life, and
Mhm.
study multiple topics at once,
Right.
right? I think these are all kinds of the major ingredients in our recipe
Right.
book for success. Am I leaving anything out, Mike?
I honestly, I think if any student actually intentionally applies all of these things, it's hard not to succeed when doing this exam. Like
Mm,
I would say, like that whenever I see a student struggling, there's usually one of these things that they're lacking. I
yeah.
found like when we talk about it's either they're memorizing things, they're not actually trying to understand them and really go in depth. They're not really reviewing, so they're lacking the spaced repetition. They might not be testing themselves regularly, so they might not be having the ability for the testing effect. They might be going subject by subject and not trying to connect the different subject areas, leaving out that real value of the real value of interleaving these content areas. So usually when we like again, you and I, we've worked one-on-one with students. Usually we really intentionally try to do these things and implement these things with students who are lacking them. And we see amazing differences. And that's why whenever anyone listening, if you're not doing all of these things, even if you're doing some of these things amazing, if there's like, oh, hey, that is something I'm actually lacking, do it. Implement, do it, try it out, test yourself. I think that testing is the one thing that would start way earlier. I'm a big proponent of like testing yourself as early as possible. Maybe not with full-length exams, but do practice problems from the very beginning. Don't wait to do them. I think that's probably one of the big ones that I scream from the hilltops the most. But yeah, all these things are super, super, super valuable.
For sure. And like you said, everyone can succeed with these strategies. It depends, how fast you will see success depends on your background. If you are, you just finished all your prereqs, you might be able to take action on these things and see faster results than someone who's been out of school for 10 years. Be realistic with yourself in your expectations. However, this is, like you said, you can't go wrong. You can't go wrong if you're following this path, okay? It might take you a little longer if we have more ground to cover, but this really is so cognitively based, psychologically based. This is how we learn, right? And these really are the best practices. So I love that we could get in here and chat about this. And in the lens of testing, right? Our next episode is going to directly hit on this topic that we talked about. Right. Last episode, we were all about MCAT passages. We even talked about spreading activation. We talked about a lot of the stuff that we mentioned here with recall cues and all those things. In our next episode, we're going to get back into strategy. We're going to apply this specifically with MCAT questions. This is going to be a very high yield episode because the questions are what are going to ultimately dictate your score.
I always say this all the time. Like, everyone has like, when I see students doing science strategy, if they're implementing it, they usually have like a science passage strategy, but they like have no question strategy. Like, what's your plan when you tackle a question? Because you might understand the passage super well, but that's actually worth 0 points. You get no points for understanding the passage. It's again necessary. No direct point. It's necessary but not sufficient, right? We need to know again, look at that callback. So we need to be able, it's foundational. We need to understand the passage, but if we don't have a strategy, if we don't know how to tackle these questions, we're still going to get these questions wrong. So I'm very excited to kind of get the second half of our science passage strategy. We've talked about the passage, and well, now let's talk about the questions. I'm super excited for it.
Woohoo! We hope you guys enjoyed today's episode, and we hope you get maybe not even more excited for the next one, but
if you were not
today's
excited
episode was
for
pretty
today,
fun too. Not to knock our memory and encoding, but the next one's pretty fun too. So.
I feel like we dug ourselves in a hole there. It's like, okay, wait, so
at least as excited.
At least if not more.
It just continues to increase for every episode. Who knows? But we hope you are excited to some degree about the next one. And we can't wait. It's
larger than zero excitement.
Yes. We hope to catch you in the next one. Until then, happy studying. Have a wonderful rest of your day or night or week or whenever.
Wherever you're catching it.
And we hope to see you again soon.
Bye now, everyone.
Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your hosts, Michael Maleka
and Molly Hudash.